Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaea Viking. Today is the official 21st video and unofficial 15th video in my series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. The subject of today's video is the Texas Revolution and the rise of manifest destiny. Now, as always, I like to point out those of us in the modern world, especially in the United States, whenever we hear of the phrases for, say, regions, countries, or states, as is the case with Texas, we tend to think of them as they are now, as they are, for example, on this map here. Now, of course, this is not an inaccurate way to look at things. After all, states and regions such as Texas have held their borders, uh, their current borders, for right around 150, give or take, years or so. So, and of course, that means that literally everyone alive, the only thing that we know about Texas in terms of its borders is how it looks like on this map. That being said, it is not the full picture. Texas only took on this political boundary uh, after a long series of events, processes, and catalysts. So, in order to get a better look at the bigger picture, we need to go back a little bit further in time, starting with the Texas Revolution. Now, this is where I want to take a brief second to give a little bit of a caveat. So, the Texas Revolution is one of the most mythologized events in United States history. And of course, it is the most mythologized event in Texas history, with events such as, and arguably the most well known event from this point in history being the Alamo, with the Alamo being arguably the most mythologized part of the Texas Revolution. That being said, as a historian and an archaeologist, my business is not in mythology, it is in history as it actually happened, as the historical documents actually, what the historical documents actually say. And I acknowledge that probably for a lot of Texas citizens, this is going to make a lot of them mad. Um, and I will acknowledge that again, but I also have to reiterate my business is not mythology, it is accurate history. And I'm sorry if that ruins a, clear, crystal clear, perfect mythology, but that's just how it's going to have to be. Now, another thing I need to address before we move on is I need to define a term, and that is the term manifest destiny. So, what is manifest destiny? Well, there are a few definitions, but they all sort of tie in together. Uh, the first definition being that manifest destiny is a 19th century, i.e., 1800s, belief that the United States was destined to expand its territory westward across the American continents to the Pacific Ocean and beyond. It was also believed that this expansion was justified and inevitable, and that the United States had a duty to settle the continent, conquer, and prosper, with some advocates believing that the Christian God had ordained this expansion and that the United States had a mission to spread democracy and capitalism across the continent. Furthermore, this idea that was built upon the idea that white Americans were divinely ordained to settle the entire continent of North America. Uh, and this ideology of manifest destiny inspired a variety of measures designed to remove and or destroy the Native American population of the Americas. So that is a very important term to define as we go into this video. And here is all of the sources that I got this information from. All right, now we move on to our first big section, Texas prior to European colonization, because it is important to look at this before we go into the bulk of what the Texas Revolution was. So, the earliest inhabitants of Texas, or the earliest confirmable inhabitants of Texas, is a group that is known as the pre-Clovis culture, which uh, had its height as a distinctive cultural group, roughly somewhere between 30,000 to 11,000 BCE. Um, there's a lot of debate on this number. The reason I put the 30,000 there is because there are a couple of archaeological sites that may have uh, a 37,000 to 40,000 year date in terms of their habitation. But again, that is highly debated. Some push it more down to 20,000, 23,000 years ago, give or take. But regardless, the rough idea is this 30,000 to 11,100 BCE, or 40,000 to 13,000 years ago, give or take. With specifically the peopling of the Americas happening somewhere, again, probably between 30,000 to 20,000 years before present. And here's another map showing sort of the routes that these people would have taken, the ancestors of the Native Americans, the pre-Columbus culture, would have taken to uh, get into the Americas, with this particular route being very important because all of the earliest archaeological evidence for the Native Americans entering North America and South America, um, and Central America, it shows or at least suggests that the ancestors of the Native Americans, who were the pre-Columbus cultures, sailed on boats, as you can see here in this picture here, along what is known as the Kelp Highway, that, as its name suggests, was a very resource dense area full of food resources, including kelp, that extended all the way along the Pacific coastline here, with food that could be utilized on the Kelp Highway, including but not being limited to things like sea lions, otters, various types of fish, and of course, mollusks, um, oysters, clams, etc. Now, that being said, that does not mean that the ancestors of the Native Americans who were the pre-Clovis culture did not hunt megafauna such as mammoths or giant ground sloths, giant ground sloths, or anything like that, because they most certainly did, especially as they began going inland. It just also means that they also utilized resources along the coast because those resources were readily available. Now, there aren't, admittedly, there aren't that many confirmed or very strongly dated uh, pre-Clovis sites in Texas. However, there are at least two that have very strong dates and very strong pieces of evidence that um, essentially confirm that the pre-Clovis culture was at around 16,000 years ago to 20,000 years ago, living in what is now Texas. As discussed in this paper by Thomas J. Williams et al., titled Evidence of Early Projectile Point Technology in North America at the Galt Site in Texas, United States. And here is a map of the Galt site, where the Galt site is in Texas here. So essentially, what Thomas J. Williams et al. Did to confirm this pre-Clovis date for the Galt site was they used a dating method known as optically stimulated luminescence to obtain the lowest dates for the lowest deposits in the Galt site. Uh, and they, in the lowest deposits, they found projectile points and stone tools, lithic material that looked that looked essentially something like this. In this picture here, they found bifaces, projectile points, blade cores, etc. And as you can see in this graph here, they took four dates from the lowest layers of the Galt site, with these dates ranging between 16,700 years ago, plus or minus a couple of thousand years, to 21,700 years ago, plus or minus a couple of thousand years. So fairly definitive dates, and a fairly robust archaeological assemblage for this site. And this is also backed up by another site known as the Deborah L. Friedkin site, as discussed in this paper by Michael R. Waters et al., titled Pre-Clovis Projectile Points at the Deborah L. Friedkin Site, Texas, Implications for the Late Pleistocene Peopling of the Americas. And this is a map showing where the Friedkin sites and the Galt, where the Friedkin site is, as well as the Galt site is. And again, what Waters et al. Did use to determine these dates was the OSL dating, the optical stimulated luminescence, to get these dates again from the lowest sediment levels of the archaeological site. And here are some of the pre-Clovis points that they found. And again, you can see there are several bifaces or biface fragments and projectile points. Again, a fairly robust archaeological assemblage showing that there is indeed at least two pre-Clovis sites within, or highly likely pre-Clovis sites in Texas. And here's again showing here's the table, the map showing the full information here that was discovered in the paper, and describing fairly well what pre-Clovis occupation is and sort of the routes they took. And then after the pre-Clovis culture, as the name suggests, there is a culture that was after it, and that would be the Clovis culture, which also lived in Texas, and it had a period, its period of when it was a distinguishable cultural group was from 11,100 to 10,800 BCE, or somewhere around 13,000 to 12,000 years ago, give or take. And again, much like the pre-Clovis people, the Clovis people were hunted megafauna and were migratory hunter-gatherers, nomadic hunter-gatherers, who utilized not necessarily every piece of the animal. That's a little bit of a myth. Nomads and indigenous cultures don't use every piece of the animal. Some pieces are indeed discarded, but they used as many pieces of the animal as they could for things like building structures, drying for food, maybe making like carrying packs, etc. And the Clovis culture gets its name from the gets its name from the Clovis points, which were discovered first actually in Texas or New Mexico. I forget exactly which state they were found in, but regardless, they have been found in Texas. And they're what the Clovis people get their name from, and they are distinctive for their leaf shape, or their rough leaf shape, oftentimes having, though not always, having this flute here that is usually only on a singular side of the projectile point, but sometimes it is on both sides, and it's where essentially you would have put the projectile point into a spear of some sort, And actually some Clovis points don't have this flute here uh, at all, which you can actually see in this picture here. But again, they are very clearly Clovis points based off of their shape and design. And as you can see, based off of this picture here, there are indeed Clovis sites within Texas. The Clovis culture was fairly widespread across the entire continent. Um, they were much more widespread than, say, their predecessors, the pre-Clovis culture, which currently the greatest extent of the pre-Clovis culture was right around here on the Great Plains, including Texas and Colorado and things such as that. And here's some more maps showing some more of the Clovis sites found in Texas. Then, after the Clovis culture, came the Folsom culture, which also lived in Texas, and its period of when it was a distinct cultural group was roughly between 10,800 to 10,200 BCE, or around 12,000 years ago. And this was a period of intense technological adaptation for the people who had once been the pre-Clovis and the Clovis cultures. And this is because previously in the pre-Clovis and in the Clovis and pre-Clovis cultures, uh, some of the most utilized animals, the most hunted animals, were what were known as megafauna: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, etc. Uh, well, during the Folsom period, or the time of the Folsom culture, these animals were beginning to die off due to a variety of factors, some overhunting, but also a lot of climate change and various other factors. And so this led the ancestors of the Native Americans, who had been the Clovis and pre-Clovis peoples, to begin adapting and making smaller projectile points uh, to hunt smaller animals, or comparatively smaller animals. Because as you can see in this picture, this person is hunting a bison, and anyone who has seen a bison knows that they are not small, but compared to a mammoth or a mastodon, they are smaller. And so while you need a big projectile point like a Clovis point uh, or a pre-Clovis point to hunt a mammoth or a mastodon, you don't necessarily need that to hunt a bison, or as things start to go on, deer or pronghorn. So that is why the ancestors of the Native Americans, as they were transitioning from the Clovis to the Folsom, began making smaller projectile points. Uh, and here's a picture of them hunting another bison there. Uh, and here's a cave painting of a bison. And here are some of the Folsom points. As you can see, they still retain some of the general shape of the Clovis point, being that they are still leaf shaped to some degree. However, as you can see there, that flute that was once down towards the lower part of the projectile point is now extending all the way up the entire shaft of the point, meaning it is a lot thinner. And of course, they began to get much smaller also, as you can see here and here and here. And here are some more examples here and here. And as you can see on this map, the Folsom culture had a slightly smaller range than the Clovis culture, as other cultures began developing depending on region, with the Folsom culture being generally contained to the Great Plains, and of course, that included parts of Texas. All right, then later on, uh, one of the earliest sort of settled cultures, sedentary cultures to develop in Texas. Not necessarily the oldest, but among the oldest, was the Mogollon culture, which lived in western Texas between roughly 200 to the early 1600s CE. And you can see that on this map here and this map here. And of course, they began building, they're well known for building various cities and adobe walled settlements, like this here. I believe this is Castle Rock, and also this settlement here. But what the Mogollon culture is especially well known for is the type of pottery that they would make, which is known as membranous pottery, which you can see here in these pictures. And then in northeast Texas lived the Catawba Mississippian culture, which lived in East Texas from roughly 800 to the early 1600s CE, as you can see in this map here. And they, like all Mississippian cultures, are known for the construction of earthen mounds, as you can see here. And then there were other Native American cultures who began developing in Texas to the south that were generally more nomadic, uh, as you can see here on this map here, and also a little bit in here. And that actually brings us to our next section: European colonization, the reintroduction of the horse into North America, and the Comanche Kiowa expansion into the southern plains. So, first, the Spanish Empire would colonize the Southwest, which includes Texas, or parts of Texas, somewhere in around early 1600 CE, with parts of Texas becoming colonies of the French Empire first in 1685 CE, while the majority of what is now Texas would become part of the Spanish Empire in 1690 CE. With the Spanish Empire implementing the brutal encomienda system in the Southwest, which was essentially an early version of what is known as chattel slavery. Now, the Spanish Empire would claim that the encomienda system was for the benefit of both settlers and Native Americans, but that's not necessarily how it actually worked. So, for example, the plan was that the Spanish colonists would protect and care for and Christianize the Native Americans, while the Native Americans of Texas would work a portion of their time for Spanish settlers. Um, but the reality was, Spanish colonists would force long labor, not pay Native American workers, and of course, failed and oftentimes outright refused to protect Native Americans while just overtly seizing Native American lands. Meanwhile, Native Americans would die from disease and harsh living and working conditions. Now, the Catholic clergy, the Jesuits, among other Catholic clergy, would protest to end the encomienda system, and rebellions by Native Americans, such as the Great Pueblo Revolt, would end the encomienda system. However, the Spanish would just create, and the Spanish would replace it with the repartimiento system. However, the repartimiento system was essentially just the encomienda system under a different name. Basically, nothing changed. Uh, and then another byproduct of Spanish colonization, of the colonization of the Southwest by the Spanish Empire, would be the early dispersal of the early reintroduction of horses into North America. Because yes, horses were here in the Americas up until around 6,000 years ago, when they went extinct due to climate change and hunting, and again, various factors. There wasn't really one factor. But when the Spanish Empire colonized the Southwest, they brought with them horses known as mustangs, uh, to, of course, as their mounts for their conquistadors. But a few of them would escape into the Great Plains and the Rockies, as described by William Timothy Trail Taylor et al. In their paper titled Early Dispersals of Domestic Horses into the Great Plains and Northern Rockies. Um, and they looked at a variety of different pieces of evidence, of course, genetic data, but also looking at archaeological evidence, as well as the wear marks on horses and such, to determine these various dates, and they were able to determine that horses escaped fairly early, basically almost immediately, at the beginning of Spanish colonization of the Southwest, including Texas, as you can see here on this map. And then, as a byproduct of that, um, and this is something that a lot of people are aware of because of Western movies and things like that, the Native Americans of the Great Plains, upon the reintroduction of the horse, would quickly become horse riding societies, which would lead to the migration of Native American nations from, say, the northern Great Plains into the southern Great Plains, such as the migration of the Comanche Nation onto the southern Great Plains somewhere between the late 1690s and 1706 CE, with the Comanche Nation becoming a major regional power in the Southwest, which I've already done a couple of videos about this. One on the early Comanche expansion into the Southwest and its wars with the Spanish Empire, and one on the Comanche Nation and its wars with the Texas Republic and uh, its relationship with Mexican Texas, that is actually part of this exact series and was the previous video before this one that I will include in the iCard, as well as the one on early Comanche expansion into the Southwest. And then, shortly after the expansion of the Comanche Nation into the southern Great Plains, would come the migration of the Kiowa Nation onto the southern Great Plains, somewhere between 1700 to the early 1790s CE, which you can see here on this map here, with the Comanche Nation forming officially and also forming a permanent military alliance with the Comanche Nation in the early 1790s CE. Now, this brings us to our next section, early claims by the United States of ownership of Texas. So, Thomas Jefferson and other early United States politicians, fairly early on in the history of the United States, wished to expand the United States west of the Mississippi. This was sort of the earliest ideas of manifest destiny. Now, it wasn't called manifest destiny yet. That wouldn't come to till I believe James K. Polk, but President James K. Polk, but while it had not had that name yet, the idea of this concept that would become manifest destiny was very much in the minds of many, if not all, United States politicians, including Thomas Jefferson, which he talked about in a letter to James Monroe in 1801 CE, an excerpt of which I will read now. The excerpt reads, "On our western and southern frontiers, Spain holds an immense country, the occupancy of which, however, is in the Indian nations, except a few insulated spots possessed by Spanish subjects. It is very questionable indeed whether the Indians would sell, whether Spain would be willing to receive these people, and nearly certain that she would not alienate the sovereignty. The same question to ourselves would recur here, also, as did in the first case. Should we be willing to have such a colony in contact with us? However, our present interests may restrain us within our own limits. It is impossible not to look forward to distant times, when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole and cover the whole northern, and if not the southern continent, with a people speaking the same language, governed in similar forms, and by similar laws. Nor can we contemplate with satisfaction either blocked or mixture on the surface." So, as you can see, Thomas Jefferson and United States politicians were very much wanting to expand west, basically at the beginning of the United States. This was not it was not a new idea by the time the 1860s and 1880s began rolling around. This was already an idea that existed. Uh, and this was can especially be seen when the United States gained the essentially conducted the Louisiana Purchase, purchasing a vast swath of land that you can see here on this map, with the United States gaining an indefinite gaining ownership of an indefinite part of Texas within the Louisiana Purchase, with the United States specifically claiming land west of the Sabine River all the way to the Rio Grande or the Rio Grande. And this, of course, the Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803 CE. With this in mind, many anti-Spanish Republicans and United States filibusters would rebel against the Spanish Empire in what would become known as the Gutierrez-Magee expedition. However, most of the rebels would be defeated and massacred by the Spanish army at the Battle of Medina on August 18th, 1813 CE, with the Gutierrez-Magee expedition happening between 1812 and 1813 CE. Then, on February 22nd, 1819 CE, Spain would cede Florida to the United States and define the boundary between the United States and the Spanish Empire's territory known as New Spain in the Adams-Onis Treaty. As part of the agreement, the United States promised to renounce its claims of ownership of Texas. However, I'm sure anybody who has seen any of my videos or is well aware of how United States history works, the United States did not keep their promise in any way and continued to offer to purchase Texas. And many white Americans would continue to believe that Texas should belong to the United States. Eventually, this would actually start to come to fruition to some degree, as an individual by the name of Stephen F. Austin would inherit a Spanish impresario grant from his father, which gave Austin permission to settle in Spanish Texas. Austin would then migrate to Spanish Texas with 300 white American families, most of whom were enslavers. And yes, for those of you who caught the name, yes, Stephen F. Austin is what the city of Austin, Texas, is who the city of Austin, Texas is named after. Which brings us to our next section, the collapse of the Spanish Empire in the Southwest and the rise of the Republic of Mexico. So, inspired by the French and Haitian revolutions, insurgents such as Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla, Ignacio Allende, and Ignacio Lopez Rayon would gradually, over the course of 10 years between 1810 to 1821 CE, overthrow Spanish rule in Mexico. And a lot of times this would be done independently, though of course sometimes they would work together. And there were actually a lot more insurgents than just these three. It's just there was only so many I could mention. And after the Spanish Empire in Mexico was overthrown, the first Mexican Empire would be established, but this would only last for 2 years between 1821 and 1823 CE, when the first Mexican Empire would be replaced by the first Mexican Republic, which lasted a little bit longer from 1824 to 1835 CE. And here's a map of the Mexican Republic here. And then with the formation of the first Mexican Republic, the province of Texas would be combined with the province of Coahuila to become the Mexican state of Coahuila y Tejas. And this will be done on March 1825 CE. And this actually brings us to our next section, foreign immigration into Mexican Texas. So the first authorized foreign immigration into Mexican Texas came with the migration of Native Americans from the east, such as the Cherokee and the Lenape, who would migrate into Texas under the leadership of Cherokee Chief Bowles, who would establish the Texas Cherokee Nation at Nacogdoches. And this would happen in the early 1820s CE. And then shortly after this, in 1825 CE, The bankrupt Mexican government would encourage immigration into the region, generally to help increase the region's population. And this would be especially appealing for white Americans in the United States, as the United States was still recovering from the economic panic of 1819 CE, which I talked about in my Era of Good Feelings video that I will include in the iCard. Finally able to settle legally in Texas, white Americans would begin to migrate to Coahuila y Tejas in large numbers. Many of these white American immigrants to Texas were enslavers, most of them bringing with them significant prejudices against other ethnic groups, attitudes often applied to the Tejanos, individuals of Mexican descent born in Texas, and the Native Americans of Texas. Furthermore, Mexico's official religion is Roman Catholicism, yet the majority of white American immigrants were Protestants who distrusted Catholics. This brings us to our next section, the Fredonian Revolt. So, uh, on December 21st, 1826 CE, white American impresario Hayden Edwards and several Texas Cherokee led by prominent Cherokee leader John D. Hunter would declare independence from Mexico and Texas in the Fredonian Revolt, and then created the Republic of Fredonia near Nacogdoches. However, Cherokee Chief Bowles would keep the majority of the Texas Cherokee from joining the revolt and would eventually execute the Cherokee leaders responsible for helping create the revolt. Meanwhile, with the aid of Stephen F. Austin, the Mexican army would march onto Fredonia and put down the revolt, with this happening between January 22nd and January 31st of 1827 CE. Now, this brings us to our next section, Mexico abolishing chattel slavery. So, Mexico didn't abolish chattel slavery right away. First, the legislature of Coahuila y Tejas would outlaw the introduction of additional enslaved people and would grant freedom at birth to all children born to an enslaved person in 1827 CE. Then, just 2 years later, Mexico would officially abolish chattel slavery, with the ratification of this abolishment taking place between 1829 and 1830 CE. Angered at the abolishment of chattel slavery, wealthy enslavers, both Mexican and white American, would begin to foment rebellion in several Mexican provinces, including Coahuila y Tejas. In response, President Anastasio Bustamante would implement the laws of April 6, 1830 CE, which, among other things, would prohibit further immigration to Texas from the United States, would increase taxes, and would reiterate the ban on chattel slavery, with Bustamante making these laws in 1830 CE. That being said, drawn by the prospect of gaining large tracts of land, white Americans from the United States would continue to migrate into Coahuila y Tejas and would soon vastly outnumber the Tejanos between 1830 and 1834 CE. Also, despite the outlawing of chattel slavery, white Americans and wealthy Tejanos would completely ignore the law and continued to import enslaved African Americans for labor on their plantations. By 1835 CE, enslaved Africans and African Americans numbered 5,000, making up 13% of the non-Native American population. Now, this brings us to our next section, the early rebellions in Texas and the rise of Santa Anna. Starting with the first Anahuac disturbance. So, in August 1831 CE, Mexican General Juan Davis Bradburn, a firm supporter of the Mexican law forbidding chattel slavery, would give asylum to 3 men who had escaped chattel slavery in Louisiana. And here's a picture showing individuals escaping chattel slavery. The enslaver of the escaped men would then retain local lawyer William B. Travis to represent him in trying to return the men to enslavement. After Travis sent a threatening letter to Bradburn, Bradburn would arrest Travis for questioning and imprison him at Fort Anahuac. This would cause the local Texan militia, consisting mostly of white American immigrants, to attack Fort Anahuac, demanding and eventually securing the release of Travis. While most of the Texans left, 15 to 30 of the Texans refused to leave, which resulted in a skirmish between the Mexican garrison and the remaining Texans. 5 Mexican soldiers and 1 Texan would die in the skirmish. After the skirmish, the remaining Texans gathered at Turtle Bayou to await the arrival of cannons coming from Brazoria, Texas, with this skirmish happening on June 10th, 1832 CE. Once at Turtle Bayou, the Texan communities near Anahuac would adopt the Turtle Bayou Resolution, which decried the quote present dynasty, claiming that it kept them under military rather than civil authority. The Texan community would also invite Mexican Colonel Domingo Ugarteca, who commanded the small fort Velasco on the Brazos River, to join their cause. However, after Ugarteca, and I apologize to any Spanish-speaking people if I butchered the pronunciation of this name, after Ugarteca refused to join their cause, the Texans attacked and defeated the Mexican garrison at Fort Velasco in what would become known as the Battle of Velasco. With these events happening between June 25th and June 26th, 1832 CE. After these battles, General Bradburn would call for reinforcements from Mexican Colonel Piedras. Piedras would send a delegation to the Texans at Turtle Bayou and negotiate for a resolution to the conflict. After, of course, receiving a list of grievances on Bradburn from the Texans. Afterwards, Bradburn would be forced to resign and leave Anahuac, with these negotiations happening on July 1st, 1832 CE, with the measures agreed to by Piedras being the reestablishment of the municipal council at Liberty, Texas, the release of civilian authorities at Anahuac to civilian authorities, or the release of civilian prisoners at Anahuac to civilian authorities, and to have Bradburn resign in favor of an officer of his choice. And here is the source I got all this information from. At the same time all this was happening, Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna would begin a rebellion to overthrow Bustamante, with this rebellion beginning in 1832 CE. Meanwhile, white Americans and Tejanos would use Santa Anna's rebellion as an excuse to take up arms, with their militias successfully driving all Mexican troops from East Texas. Buoyed by their success, Texans hold 2 political conventions to persuade Mexican authorities to weaken the laws of April 6, 1830 CE, with these rebellions, with these small rebellions happening in 1832 CE at the same time the early parts of Santa Anna's rebellion in Mexico was happening, and in southern Mexico was happening. Then, in October 1832 CE, Stephen F. Austin and 55 white American impresarios would hold a convention at San Felipe de Austin, where they would petition the Mexican government for changes in the governance of Coahuila y Tejas. Then, between April 1st and April 13th, 1833 CE, 56 white American impresarios, including William H. Harton and Sam Houston, would hold another convention at San Felipe de Austin, where they would petition for independent Mexican statehood of the province of Texas. This now brings us to our next section, the Second Anahuac disturbance. So, despite the compromises brought forth by the Mexican government in 1833 CE, tensions would continue to escalate as some citizens would demonstrate with anti-taxation protests and petitions, which would eventually result in the arrest of white American merchants Andrew Briscoe and his partner DeWitt Clinton Harris for their protests against taxes in the region. with both of these individuals being arrested on June 27th, 1835 CE. In response to this arrest, William B. Travis would gather 25 Texan militiamen. The militia would then attack Anahuac and defeat and expel the small 40-man Mexican garrison, afterwards freeing the Texan merchants. After the attack on Anahuac, because he had acted without broad community support, Travis would apologize to avoid endangering Stephen F. Austin, who had traveled to and was currently in the capital of Mexico, Mexico City. Then in October 23rd, 1835 CE, Santa Anna would overthrow the First Mexican Republic and establish the Centralist Republic of Mexico, with Santa Anna disbanding the Mexican Constitution of 1824 CE and disbanding local militias. This would lead to several Mexican provinces beginning to rebel, which you can see on this map here. Now this leads us to our next section, a very interesting section. What public opinion on Texas looked like within the United States. Well, for one thing, public opinion on Texas was divided in the United States, with some politicians, such as Henry Clay, believing the United States should expand into Texas as part of the growing concept of the United States Manifest Destiny that we talked about in the very beginning of the video, and also as an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, which was a doctrine put forth by President James Monroe, basically saying that the New World, North America, Central America, and South America, was the domain of the United States and not European powers. Something I talked about in my video on the Era of Good Feelings, which I, again, will link in the iCard. Meanwhile, other United States politicians, such as John Quincy Adams, would be against the United States expansion, believing that it would overextend the United States and eventually would lead to its collapse, with Adams and his faction often using the overextension and eventual collapse of the Roman Empire as examples for the argument for less expansion of the United States. And this is a picture of sort of the concept of the fallen Roman Empire here. Now this brings us to the part of the video I'm sure everyone watching was waiting for, the Texas Revolution itself. So, for one thing, as a possibility of the outbreak of a revolution began to increase, Sam Houston, a longtime ally of the Cherokee, would negotiate a treaty with Chief Bowles and the Texas Cherokee, with Houston promising to provide the Texas Cherokee with a definitive homeland within Texas in return for support of the Texan cause, with this negotiation and signing of a treaty happening on February 23rd, 1835 CE. Then in September 1835 CE, Santa Anna, realizing that without Coahuila y Tejas acting as a buffer, that it would be likely that the influence of the United States would spread and the Mexican territories of Nuevo Mexico and Alta California would be at risk of future white American encroachment. Unwilling to battle the United States until the unrest within Mexico was subdued, Santa Anna decided to order his brother-in-law, General Martin Perfecto de Cos, to lead 500 soldiers to Texas to quell any potential rebellion. And this would lead Stephen F. Austin to call on John Henry Moore to defend the white American settlements in the region, with John Henry Moore and the Texan militia defeating the Mexican army at the Battle of Gonzales, officially igniting the Texas Revolution on October 2nd, 1835 CE. And then on October 10th, 1835 CE, the Texan army would defeat General Coles at the Battle of Goliad, and also in the Battle of Lepentitlan on November 4th, 1835 CE. Then And also in November of 1835 CE, Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, and other white American impresarios would hold the what was called the Consultation of 1835 CE, where they would express to Santa Anna that they just simply had allegiance to the deposed Constitution of 1824 CE, of course, asking for its reinstatement. And also, they maintained their right to form a general council. Then, in between October 12th and December 11th, 1835 CE, at the same time that the battles of Goliad and Lipan Titlan were happening, General Coles would lay siege to the city of Behar, also known as Bexar, but would be defeated and forced to lift the siege. With the rebellion now having begun, the Texan army the Texas Army would begin calling for volunteers from the United States, promising land in return for service. This would lead many white Americans, such as the very famous Davy Crockett, to migrate to Texas to join the Texan Army. And this actually brings us to a very interesting subject that needs very much to be discussed. And that is that with the beginning of the the Texas Revolution, the Texan Army began to use heavy symbolism connected to the American Revolution, as seen in the Texan flag that was used at the Battle of Gonzales, that stated, "Come and take it," which echoed the words of the Continental Army soldiers in Georgia that defended Fort Morris from the British Army in 1778 CE. And it can also be seen in the Texan flag stating liberty or death, which echoes the very famous speech by Patrick Henry at the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1775 CE. With rumors that Santa Anna was preparing for a large army to advance into Texas and put down the Texan rebellion, rhetoric would degenerate into framing the conflict as a race war between white Americans defending their property against, in the words of white American David G. Burnett, a mongrel race of degenerate Spaniards and Indians more depraved than they. And that actually brings us to our next section, what the Texan and Mexican army looked like at the onset of the Texas Revolution. Starting with the Texan army, which numbered roughly 3,500 soldiers and consisted mostly of white Americans, including 1,000 volunteers from the United States. In contrast, only 138 Tejanos were in the Texan army. Meanwhile, the Texas Cherokee provided no soldiers for the Texan Army, but promised to offer support when needed and refused to side with Santa Anna. And generally, the Texan Army was fairly diverse in terms of clothing and uniform. There were some professional soldiers, which we'll get to in a minute, but there's a good example here of Sam Houston, who spent much of his career in the United States military. But generally, a lot of the Texan Army were frontiersmen who were experienced in hunting and some like minor skirmishes and some time in the Texan militia. But generally, the majority of the Texan Army were farmers and ranchers and such who had just simply been called up for service in the Texan Army. That being said, as I already stated a little bit earlier, there were some professional soldiers within the Texan Army, and you can see that in these uniforms right here based on the uniform of the United States Army. Meanwhile, the Mexican army numbered 7,000 soldiers. However, the majority of the troops participating in the war had been either conscripted or were convicts who chose military service over jail, and therefore the majority of the Texan army that would soon march into the majority of the Mexican army that would soon march into Texas was largely inexperienced. The Mexican army also included a large contingent of women soldiers and officers known as soldaderas, as well as a large number of children who followed the army, with the latter group often reducing the supplies of the Mexican army. And here's a couple of pictures of sotileras, and generally showing that there was, much like the Texan army, there was some degree of diversity in the uniform that was worn by the sotileras. Now, the Mexican army, in contrast to the Texan army, had a much more consistent. Uh, the uniforms they wore were far more consistent, as you can see here. They were much more uniform. Pardon my pun. No pun intended. And you can see that here in these pictures here, as well as in these pictures here. And now this brings us to the weapons used by the Texan Army. So much like their uniforms, the firearms used by the Texan Army were fairly diverse. Some, if they could afford it, used the relatively new model 1814 common rifles that use percussion cap technology to ignite the gunpowder rather than flint, or rather than flintlock. Or they would use the Model 12 Type 2 flintlock musket, the U.S. Springfield Model 1812 Type 2 flintlock musket, which you can see here. And a lot of the soldiers in the Texan Army would also use the Kentucky long rifle, a very famous rifle known for its range, and of course is a completely American made and American invented rifle that was very well respected during this time. And then for small arms, you would have flintlock pistols here. And then for up close fighting, some Texan soldiers, not all, would be equipped with a short sword known as an artillery sword, seen here. Several Texan soldiers would be equipped with Bowie knives, named for an individual by the name of James Bowie, whom we'll talk about in a minute. And then officers would, and the newly created Texas Rangers would wield, some of the newly created Texas Rangers, not all, would wield cavalry sabers. Also, though they were relatively small in number, the Texan Army did have access to a few of the most common cannon type used in the United States and Mexico at the time, and a lot of your countries and empires at the time, the 6-pound field cannons. Which now brings us to the weapons of the Mexican Army. So, much like their uniforms, the Mexican Army was far more consistent with the types of firearms that they used, with the two most common firearms used by the Mexican Army being the British Baker rifle, also known as the Pattern 1800 infantry rifle, and the British Brown Bess, also known as the British Land Pattern musket. And they, again, much like the Texan Army, the dragoons, the cavalry of the Mexican Army, and soldiers would use flintlock pistols. And the Mexican Army would also use, the infantry would also use various types of short swords, not artillery swords, but still various types of short swords that, as you can see here, are more reminiscent of machetes, or also fairly reminiscent of a type of short sword from Italy and Spain known as the falchion. And the Mexican cavalry would be particularly well known for using steel lances to charge into infantry formations, and the cavalry, as well as the commanders of the Mexican army would use sabers. And as I already said, with the weapons used by the Texan army, the Mexican army would have several, and actually, of course, would have many more of these fairly common 6-pound field cannons at their disposal. Now, this moves us to our next section. The operations of the Mexican army, essentially the the retaliation of the Mexican army against the Texan army. So, for one thing, Santa Anna would transfer his presidential duties to Miguel Barragan in order to personally lead troops to put an end to the Texan rebellion. Uh, at the same time, in December of 1835 CE, Jose Maria de Tornel y Mendeville and the Mexican Congress would issue the Tornel Decree, declaring that any foreigners fighting against Mexican troops, quote, will be deemed pirates and dealt with as such, being citizens of no nation presently at war with the Republic and fighting under no recognized flag. Essentially saying that any foreigners fighting against Mexican troops would be executed. While the Tornel decree was being issued, Santa Anna and the Mexican army in December of 1835 CE would begin to march toward Texas. However, progress would be slow due to raids by Comanche and Kiowa warriors, as well as rampant hypothermia from the winter weather and rampant disease such as dysentery. And here are some Comanche and Kiowa warriors here. While the Mexican army was marching to Texas, Santa Anna and his commanders would receive timely intelligence on Texan troop locations, strengths, and plans from a network of Tejano spies loyal to Mexico. These spies would inform Santa Anna that most of the Texan army was along the coast preparing for an expedition into Mexico, leaving the city of Bejar, also known as Bexar, poorly defended by a small garrison in the Alamo Mission. As a result, Santa Anna would march the bulk of his army to Bexar. Meanwhile, the Alamo Mission was defended by only 260 Texan soldiers, including William Travis, Jim Bowie, and Davy Crockett. Santa Anna would then, upon reaching the Bexar, would lay siege to the Alamo Mission for 2 weeks before massacring the entire Texan army present at the Alamo. This would happen between February 23rd and March 6th of 1836 CE. And I do want to pause here because I'm sure the fact that I did not go into more detail about the Alamo siege has angered or at least annoyed many Texas citizens. However, as I said in the very beginning of the video, my job as a historian and archaeologist, my realm is actual history, not mythology. And unfortunately, the Alamo siege has been mythologized more and more over the years, and much of what we know about it is mainly mythology. And also, in the grand scheme of the Texas Revolution, it was really fairly insignificant compared to most of the other events happening in the Texas Revolution. So, sorry, but it's just simply not as important as the rest of the events that we have talked about and will talk about in the rest of this video. Now this brings us to our next section, the Texas Convention of 1836 CE. So, in March 1836 CE, Stephen F. Austin and other white American impresarios would organize a provisional government for Texas, with Texas officially declaring independence from Mexico in this convention. In this convention, David G. Burnett would be declared interim president of the new nation. Meanwhile, Sam Houston would be officially appointed commander-in-chief of the Texan Army. Now this leads us to our next section, the Goliad campaign. So, uh, while the siege of the Alamo was happening, Sam Houston and the Texan army would evacuate the city of Gonzales. The Texan army and the citizens of Gonzales would retreat into what is known. Would retreat in an event that is known as the Runaway Scrape. Gonzales would then be burned by the Mexican army shortly after, and this would happen on March 11th, 1836 CE. In conjunction with Santa Anna's assault on Bexar, Mexican General Jose de Uria would initiate the Goliad campaign, defeating the Texan army at the Battle of Refugio and the Battle of Coleto between March 12th and March 20th of 1836 CE. Then on March 27th, 1836 CE, despite appeals for clemency by General Jose de Uria, nearly 500 Texan prisoners would be massacred under the order of Santa Anna in what would become known as the Goliad Massacre. Then on April 18th, 1836 CE, Santa Anna's scouts would incorrectly report that Sam Houston was going to attempt to move his army to cross the ferry at Lynchburg, Texas, to rejoin the Texas government at Galveston. Following these false reports, Santa Anna would burn Harrisburg, Texas, before marching toward Lynchburg. Now this brings us to our next section, the Battle of San Jacinto. So, on April 20th, Santa Anna would reach Lynchburg and would camp along Buffalo Bayou near Lynchburg. Over the protests of several of his officers, Santa Anna would choose to make camp in a vulnerable location, a plain near the San Jacinto River, bordered by woods on one side, marsh and lake on another side. Sam Houston's army would also arrive on April 20th, 1836 CE, and would proceed to battle the Mexican army in several inconclusive skirmishes, after which he would order his army to make camp just 500 yards from the Mexican encampment. As on April 21st, 1836, as the morning wore on with no attacks on the Mexican encampment by the Texan army, Santa Anna would give the Mexican soldiers permission to sleep, rest, eat, and bathe, as most of the soldiers were new recruits, as we talked about in the section on the Mexican army, who were exhausted from marching for 24 hours without food or sleep. Meanwhile, there would be some Mexican reinforcements that would arrive this same day. And after seeing these reinforcements arrive, Houston would order his army to burn a bridge known as Vince's Bridge to prevent further Mexican reinforcements from arriving. Then, taking advantage of the Mexican army resting, the Texan army would sneak up on the Mexican encampment, ambush it, and would defeat the unprepared Mexican army in the Battle of San Jacinto. Which now brings us to our next section, the end of the Texas Revolution. So the following day, April 22nd, 1836 CE, Santa Anna, who had fled the Battle of San Jacinto and attempted to escape via Vince's Bridge and hide, would be captured and forced to surrender to the Texan army. With the Texas Revolution officially ending with the signing of the treaties of Velasco, making the Texas Revolution successful. Santa Anna and the Mexican army would gradually withdraw back to Mexico. Now this brings us to our last section, the aftermath of the Texas Revolution. Well, for one thing, on October 22nd, 1836 CE, Sam Houston would be elected the first official president of the Texas Republic. After his election, Sam Houston would attempt to complete his end of the treaty with Chief Bowles and the Texas Cherokee, uh, and would attempt to ratify the treaty between the Texas Cherokee and Sam Houston that had been signed in 1835 CE. However, Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, a longtime proponent of the removal of all Native Americans from Texas and the United States, as well as the majority of the Texas legislature, would refuse to ratify the treaty. This would lead to increased tensions between the Republic of Texas and the Texas Cherokee, with the Texas legislature's refusal to ratify this treaty happening on December 16th, 1837 CE. Then, at the same time this was happening, Sam Houston would begin peace negotiations with the Comanche and Kiowa nations. However, Mirabeau, Bonaparte, Lamar, and other supporters of Indian removal would continue to hamper peace talks, and this would lay the groundwork for future wars between the Comanche Nation, Kiowa Nation, and the Texas Republic. Then in 1838 CE, the Texas legislature would petition the United States to annex Texas into the United States. Now, I do want to pause here. So oftentimes, the myth of the Texas Revolution will paint it as it was always the goal of the individuals behind the Texas Revolution to create the Texas Republic. This is not true. They always had the plan of trying to annex Texas into the United States. Uh, the Texas Republic, as we know it in the Texas myth, only came after this. Uh, and what was the reason for that? That is because, however, despite the petitions from the Texas legislature to annex Texas into the United States, John Quincy Adams would prevent the motion from coming to a vote by filibustering for 22 days. As a result, President Martin Van Buren, unwilling to cause a political scandal, would refuse to annex Texas into the United States. As a result of this refusal of the United States to annex Texas into the United States, the Texas Republic would begin shifting away from using the symbolism of the American Revolution, as they realize they now no longer fit within the uh, grander scheme of the United States history and culture. Or well, that's not completely true. They very much did, but the leaders of the Texas Republic began to perceive it that way, and so they began to mythologize the Texas Revolution as a quote unique event, which can be seen in the creation of a heroic pantheon of Texas founders such as Stephen F. Austin, who would become known as the father of Texas, and martyrs from the Battle of the Alamo and the Goliad Massacre, such as Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. So yes, as I already talked about in the previous slide, the whole idea that the leaders of the Texas Revolution had always planned to create an independent republic of Texas uh, did not show up until after Texas had already attempted to enter the United States as a state and had been rejected. So this was again a myth created essentially as a reaction of being rejected by the United States. Then after this refusal by the United States to annex Texas into the United States as a state, the Republic of Texas would create its constitution and would, in this constitution, make chattel slavery legal in the Texas Republic, with this specifically being outlined in Section 9 of the general provisions of the Texas Constitution that states people of color who had been servants for life under Mexican law will become property. Congress should pass no law restricting immigrants from bringing their enslaved people into Texas. Congress shall not have the power to emancipate enslaved people. Slave owners may not free their enslaved servants without congressional approval unless the freed people leave Texas. Free persons of African descent are required to petition Texas for permission to continue living in the country. Uh, and Africans and the descendants of Africans and Indians, Native Americans, uh, are excluded from the class of persons having rights. And I want to make this very clear. This is exactly as the Texas Constitution reads. So I do apologize to Native Americans for using the phrase Indians, and I apologize for my grammar. And I do also want to point out it makes the outlining of this in this Constitution makes complete sense when you realize that so much of the Texas Revolution, not all, but so much of the Texas Revolution was built upon chattel slavery. As we saw earlier in this video, several times in this video, chattel slavery was one of, not the main, not the only cause, but one of the main causes of the Texas Revolution. And again, I know this is going to make a lot of Texas citizens angry because this is not part of the mythology of the Texas Revolution. But that's again it's my job as a historian and an archaeologist to look at actual history, not mythology. Then, after the Texas Revolution and after, and also before the uh, rejection of annexation into the United States of Texas, the Republic of Texas would begin inviting white Americans to immigrate to Texas, promising 800 acres of land for each settler. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the Mexican defeat in the Texas Revolution would bring fears in Mexico of an invasion of Mexico by the United States and white Americans. This fear would serve as a catalyst for the development of Mexican nationalism based on Mexican pride for indigenous heritage within mestizo communities of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent, pride for the Spanish language, and staunch Catholicism. These, in turn, would be strengthened by Neo-Aztecism movements based on hypernational views of the past Aztec Empire, more properly known as the Triple Alliance. It would also these beliefs would also be strengthened by Hispanophobia towards Spanish people and the distrust of the United States. Also, the Texas Revolution would lay the groundwork for the eventual Mexican-American War, as tensions between the United States and Texas and Mexico would remain and would continue to grow exponentially, especially based around this idea of manifest destiny. All right, so this brings us to the end of our video. So, as I have said in the previous videos, I hope you enjoyed parts of this video, especially as it pertained to the aspects of culture and such within Texas. But I really hope you did not enjoy hearing about things like chattel slavery, the treatment of Native Americans, etc. And as I've said in the previous videos, I understand as the maker of this video that it's very odd for me to want, to not want people to enjoy parts of this video. However, I bring up parts of this video not for entertainment, but for education, because a lot of this has been, especially in the case of the Texas Revolution, has been obscured by mythology and or outright ignored in history books. So it's important to bring the actual history of an event like the Texas Revolution to bear, because it did indeed have a massive impact on the United States and on peoples, including enslaved and free African Americans, the people of Mexico, and Native Americans. All right, so with that, I'm going to end this video. If you want to see me cover any of the subjects I mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.